This is the active shooter response training PowerPoint that we're going to go through for Alachua County Fire Rescue. And we're going to introduce to you the rapid treatment model that we want everybody to learn and get a basic concept of for our upcoming events throughout the department that we're going to be doing with some active shooter training and an SOP, SOG that we're going to get instituted for our response should we ever have an incident like this here in Alachua County. A little bit of an overview. This is just going to give us the basic concepts of response for Alachua County Fire Rescue to active shooter incidents and establish a foundation for the framework of what we're actually going to do for operational considerations for our EMS and first responders that are going to be responding to these incidents. Certainly we're going to have a lot of interagency cooperation and a lot of training with other agencies that will come at a later date. And our training division is setting up some active shooter stuff for us to do not only through district drill but an actual active shooter setup later towards the end of this year. Some key concepts that we're going to learn throughout this that we're going to start the foundation with now. Some new roles with EMS, and this is going to be new to a lot of people I know for years. If you go back as far as those of us who are considered dinosaurs in EMS, they've always said, you know, scene safe BSI, and that's always been pounded into our brains to learn over the years. But this is something that we're going to change now, and something that you're going to see how this whole thing evolves throughout our training and how it applies to us. There's going to be a lot of multi-agency joint training, and we need to do that on a regular basis in order to get better and learn new types of procedures and implement new operational decisions that we're going to have. We're going to do some regular drills and some mock incidents, and certainly we're going to continue to do extra training and continued education for things towards active shooter. So what's the need for this program? Well, since the Columbine active shooter, they've learned a lot about the response of not only law enforcement but certainly EMS to these types of incidents. And you're going to see later in this PowerPoint there was something called the Hartford study that came out that actually covered while there were some of the lives that were lost during the Columbine incident that could have actually been saved had we changed our response to that particular incident. And that had a nationwide effect from a lot of people and a lot of agencies, and they took that into play and did a review, and they decided that this is the new approach EMS is going to take to these types of incidents. The biggest thing they learned from them was that EMS doing the typical stage, wait for the scene to be safe, they weren't able to respond in a timely manner, and patients that were hemorrhaging or that had major injuries that couldn't be at least initially stabilized were actually becoming fatalities. So they implemented a new plan, which we're going to learn here throughout this program, that's going to cover how EMS is actually going to be a part of this whole scene while it is still actively underway under the protection of law enforcement to be able to provide immediate care to the injured victims and reduce the mortality rate of these particular injuries.
Good day. We're coming on the air with a story we have had to report far too many times. Another school shooting, this one taking place in Marysville, Washington at about 10:45 Pacific time. You can see the pictures that we've seen too many times before, kids running from the classrooms. Early reports, we stress early reports of perhaps 6 injured. That comes from an interview that was done with a parent whose child was apparently in the cafeteria at the time and witnessed a number of people wounded in a shooting. We're getting very little information about what's going on now, except that police are continuing to secure building by building.
We start tonight with the story that sent a chill through parents today. Parents who send their kids to school, trusting and hoping that they'll be safe. But in one of those schools, a high school in Ohio, today the worst happened. The police say a student opened fire on classmates, leaving 1 dead and 4 others wounded, 2 of them in critical condition. It happened at Chardon High School, 30 miles south of Cleveland.
It's believed at this hour, and it's been confirmed to ABC News by state police there in Connecticut, that 2 shooters were initially believed involved in the mass shooting. One of those shooters now dead. What's not been confirmed is whether or not that gunman took his own life or whether or not there was something that ensued after authorities began arriving.
More than 140 people, mostly children, were killed by Taliban gunmen. It's really the silence that was so uncanny, because it's the middle of the school day. This should be a noisy place, alive with the...
Following breaking news out of Nevada, where police are on the scene of a shooting at a middle school. It happened just after 7:15 this morning at Sparks Middle School.
When we start with that breaking news that we continue to follow in Roswell, New Mexico. Right now, police are investigating a shooting at Barindo Middle School. 2 minors apparently victims in that shooting.
One thing for a armed state police officer to enter a school and do his or her job. It's another thing for a teacher or staff member to intervene in a situation like this. I commend the principal and the people that work at this school for saving many more lives.
I saw people running and screaming, and then teachers told everyone to stay calm, and it was crazy.
I kind of hoped that Baltimore County would be immune from this type of activity, but apparently we're not.
From what we know as we stand here today, we believe that an instructor heroically stepped in initially to stop this attack.
So what's the switch? So fire and EMS agencies are now, and for the past few years, they've been making a change in their response to active shooter, and it's a simple switch of being reactive to being proactive. No longer are we going to stage, EMS personnel away from the scene and wait for these types of incidents to be completely clear, because by that point, when EMS arrives, many of the people that could have been saved have become fatalities. We're going to be working in direct cooperation with law enforcement officers, as I said earlier, while the actual incident is underway. There's going to be some further training in that, of course. I know this is a new mindset that a lot of people are going to have to try to put their head around and realize that this is a big switch for us. It certainly is not an easy switch, but we're going to provide all the necessary training and information to try to get us to that point. And as I said before, the whole scene safe BSI mentality from years ago, it no longer applies, because technically when we respond to these types of incidents and we're actually working on them, there is not going to be a safe scene, because it is still an active shooter incident. So mass casualty under active shooter, we start to think about back to Columbine is probably the first thing that a lot of people think of, and I actually learned this for myself. The actual first mass casualty or active shooter mass casualty incident happened in 1949. Howard Unruh was a military personnel, lived in Camden, New Jersey. He was sitting at home one day, had a little argument with his mother. His mother felt that perhaps he wasn't acting right and left for a friend's house. And this gentleman decided to get dressed in a suit and grabbed one of his firearms and started walking around his neighborhood in the local area town, just shooting random people, including several children. I believe overall there were 12 people that died. So this goes back a long way. As you can see, we've given you some statistics here that cover the average number of deaths per these types of incidents, some of the demographics on the shooters, and some of the things that occurred during these types of incidents. For example, typically active shooter, they're not looking to take hostages, they're not looking to negotiate, they're looking to cause the greatest amount of harm in the fastest amount of time that they can, which is why our response and us getting there immediately to treat these patients is absolutely paramount, because typically there are going to be a large number of patients. Some more information just based on the type of demographic where these type of incidents occur. Certainly we all know with Columbine, being a high school, 24% of these types of incidents happen in schools, 11% in office buildings, 24% in open commercial areas. I know recently in Munich we had a mass casualty shooting in a mall, where a gentleman just went inside to a mall and started shooting random people. Factories and warehouses, which is also considered more of a work type place violence, and then 29% in other areas, and that would include other types of workplaces, military bases, and those types of places. So what's the immediate need? A lot of people are going to ask themselves, why do we have to rush in there while the scene is still going on with law enforcement to try to get in there right away? Well, as you can see here, it does say 93% of the incidents were over prior to the first responding asset, which is police or fire. Statistically, a lot of these incidents were actually ended by the shooter, where after they had caused the harm that they intended to cause, a lot of times they have taken their own life. So once the situation was recognized and first responders were able to get on scene, law enforcement, fire, EMS, this scene was already over with, but unknowing to them because the person that was responsible for the incident had already taken their own life. 31 of the incidents that we had listed, going back to the early 2000s, 31 of the incidents, police actually arrived in time to somehow interrupt. And in that case, when they were able to stop or at least interrupt what was happening with the active shooter incident, they had patients laying everywhere and they had a law enforcement job that they had to do. So that was kind of where they recognized that if we could have EMS in conjunction with police to treat patients while the scene is being mitigated, we could get these patients treated much faster and have better outcomes. So here's something that everybody's always familiar with, whether it's related to fire, EMS. We always talk about the hot zone, the warm zone, the cold zone. And this is going to be a change for us as well. Something that we're going to look at here a little bit later. Obviously, when it comes to EMS type incidents, we always say we're never in the hot zone or even the warm zone. We're always in the cold zone where we're going to accept patients and treat them and get them to the hospital. In this particular case, for the new model, the rapid treatment model for active shooter, EMS is going to be most specifically assigned to some dedicated areas in the warm zone. We will not be operating in the hot zone, but we will be working throughout areas of the warm zone and then into an undeclared area between the warm and cold zone where we may have to collect patients, and we'll learn about that here a little bit later. So classic example, Columbine, April 1999. Many of us are familiar with this when this particular active shooter incident happened at a high school. 2 high school kids had somewhat methodically planned out an attack on their own school. 13 people total were killed, lost their lives in that incident, with an additional 20 wounded. And I do want to take your attention to the little picture here on this slide where it says 1 bleeding to death. That was written on a small dry erase board and held up in the window to notify personnel outside the building, the first responders, that they had a teacher actually who had been shot. He was bleeding to death and there was no one there to help him. Subsequently, he ended up being one of the 13 fatalities. And again, this was part of the transition that we learned from this particular incident and other incidents that have happened over the years, why we're switching for EMS to now become a primary part of the actual incident while it is still underway, and get to these people and stop major hemorrhaging where we can show that there's a much better significant outcome if we get to them very early.
All right, Bob, thanks. As we approach the 1-year anniversary of Sandy Hook this weekend, tonight a look at some of what we have learned. After Sandy Hook, some of the top trauma surgeons in the country, including some here in Connecticut, put together a think tank to try to come up with a plan to save lives of more of the wounded in a mass shooting like Sandy Hook. Their findings have now been adopted as the new federal government guidelines for handling mass shootings, and they are controversial. They want medical personnel injected into the danger zone while the shooting is still going on. But there are some who question that plan, including the Connecticut State Police.
When the horror of Sandy Hook played out in front of Connecticut and the world, Hartford Hospital trauma surgeon Dr. Lenworth Jacobs had one thought.
Some good had to come of this.
Dr. Jacobs put together what became the Hartford Consensus, a group of medical professionals, police, fire, FBI, and military to look at how to save the lives of more people who are shot in a mass shooting. The medical answer is simple. Stop the bleeding faster.
The classic reason that you die from these events is bleeding. So you have to identify the bleeding and stop it, or start to stop it, very quickly.
The group says the best way to do that is to get medical professionals to the wounded even when bullets may still be flying.
There's a hot zone or danger zone where there's an active shooter. That is a highly dangerous place. There's a warm zone, which is out of line of sight of the shooter, but still has danger associated with it. And there's a cold zone, which is safe. And classically, the medical response has been quarantined in the safe or cold zone, and law enforcement is in the hot or danger zone.
The Hartford Consensus found that getting medical personnel quickly at least into the warm zone and having some officers in the hot zone deal with the wounded instead of the shooter will save lives.
If there are 4 or 5 policemen there, and somebody is bleeding, at least one of them needs to address that bleeding right now and move that patient back to where the medical people can take care of them.
The group says a perfect example of how fast medical attention saved lives is the Boston Marathon bombing. The blast left more than 260 people with incredibly serious wounds there. Some of them lost limbs, but in the end, only 3 people died.
In Boston, the public got involved, the first responders got involved. Really significant and severe injuries were dealt with immediately, transported to hospital, and the survival rate was absolutely phenomenal.
But bringing medical personnel into an active shooting scene has great risk, and Connecticut State Police say the risk may be too great.
We're not bringing anyone with us. We don't have medical personnel with us. We don't have any outsiders with us, if you will. But also understand that every trooper in the state of Connecticut has been trained in emergency care, and we have certain equipment that we carry that we're able to utilize in a hot zone to provide immediate emergency care.
Lieutenant J. Paul Vance of the Connecticut State Police says every tactical team on the state force already has a medical professional, but in the chaos of an active shooter scene, when the first couple of officers there have to take on the threat head on, the new federal guidelines are just too dangerous.
That's the real situation. There's no chance for second guessing, and it can be extremely dangerous. And certainly we would be very cautious looking at something like that.
Now, the group did determine that having doctors inside Sandy Hook Elementary sooner last December would not have made any difference because the wounds were just that severe. But they insist that as these situations come up, the risk of putting medical professionals close to what's happening will pay off by saving more lives.
So a little bit of wound data information, and I want to get your attention to some of these numbers. You know, sometimes numbers appear to be that they're just numbers. If you read it, says 90% of deaths occurred prior to definitive care. So basically what that's saying is 90% of the people that died all happened before they were able to get the definitive care that they needed for their wounds. But if you look at the breakdown as to the timeline on how these people died, and you go down to about the third space where it says 16% of the people died within 15 to 30 minutes, basically, we're looking at approximately 30% of the people that had these significant injuries that would have otherwise died that can either be significantly reduced or their lives can be actually saved by EMS becoming an active part of the immediate response to this scene and treating patients within usually the first, they're saying now, 30 minutes or less, sometimes even less than that. And again, it all depends on the resources available and how fast we can get these types of incidents set up with law enforcement and take action. And that's something that we're going to do through our training that we're going to actually do out in the field here when we do our active shooter incidents. Most importantly, if you look here at the bottom of this slide too, I want to point out it says only 10% of combat deaths occur after care has been initiated. So that's an important thing to show you that once a lot of these people were responded to by medical personnel and care was initiated, the chance for their survivability was actually great. And if you look over the years with this percentages here, starting at World War I, going all the way up now to what we have, the War on Terror, how the mindset has changed of, you know, you've seen the old black and white videos where they have combat medics with no way to protect themselves, just running around with explosions going off in the field, trying to help as many people as they can. They had a 30% survivability rate back in World War I. And as the mentality and the training has changed over the years, you can see up to now, the survivability rate is 95 to 98%. And a lot of that is because we've changed what we've done over the years. We've changed how we've responded, what we've responded with. Certainly we have better equipment available to us. We have better training. And we're learning new medical procedures and new tactics, for a better way to say it. And that's one of the reasons, again, for EMS to be taking part in this whole event. So the greatest benefit will be achieved through a combined effort. Certainly there is not one agency at all that's going to be responding to any of these types of incidents that alone is going to handle the incident. We are going to have law enforcement. We are going to have dedicated EMS personnel. Certainly we're going to have fire units on standby. We've discussed things like depending on the size of an incident, we may need to have actual physicians respond to the scene. We're looking at mutual aid. We're probably going to have air transport necessary depending on the number of patients to get people in and out of county to the appropriate facilities because they're going to be overwhelmed with the number of patients they could potentially have. So it is definitely a combined effort. And that is going to be achieved through each agency's expertise. Remembering that anytime we have an active shooter incident, it is always going to be specifically under the direct command or charge of law enforcement. However, through our SOPs, this is actually going to be a unified command where our command staff will be working in conjunction with law enforcement to set up a unified command so that we're all working together to mitigate this type of incident. Familiarity, that simply comes with how we practice, knowing what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. Makes us better each day. Just with what we do now with fire and EMS, the same applies to this. The more we practice it, the better we're going to be. Simplicity, we're not looking to make this extremely technical. We've taken some information that we will cover later, like some tactical emergency casualty care, which some of our military folks are familiar with, and they've broken it down for civilian use. It's very simple. We've incorporated it into our EMS protocols, and that's something that we're going to be learning, very basic of what we have to do in order to mitigate this type of situation. And then again, like I said earlier, unification, bringing all of our different agencies together. We may learn some new communications that we need that we didn't have existing, resources that other agencies have that we were not aware of, and vice versa. And bringing all this together, I think, will make us most prepared should we ever have an incident like this. So just to kind of show you, we've got several different agencies that we're going to go through here just to kind of show that everyone has taken part in this. There's not any one particular agency that is spearheading this or saying this is what we should do. Everyone is on board. While it is a new way of doing things and some people will have some difficulty accepting it, pretty much nationwide, this is something that a lot of agencies have gotten behind and worked together, that they support because they've found it's the best way to respond to active shooter. This is the U.S. Fire Administration. Of course, they certainly have support into this. The IAFF, that's certainly going to be a big one. A lot of people look to see what their take is on things. And obviously, as you can see here, they've basically added that, in simplest terms, agencies working together and coming to these types of incidents are going to have significantly better outcomes. And you can kind of read through there and see just what their stance is on it. But everyone is pretty much taking the same stance on this is the new way and this is how we're going to do it, and we're going to work together to do it. International Association of Fire Chiefs, and certainly law enforcement, and the National Center for Disaster Medicine and Public Health. Everyone's pretty much on the same page. So now we're taking the information that we've got from them on a national level, and we're going to utilize it here locally to set up our best practices response for an incident like this here in our area. So current fire and EMS response, fire and EMS integration, it does vary widely. We do have a lot of two-tiered systems. Certainly our response here, Alachua County Fire Rescue, we are the primary medical transport provider. We do have the COPCN, and we have all the ambulances that would be transporting patients. But depending on where in the county this would happen, certainly we have city folks from GFR that we'd be working with, and then some of our outerlining areas. So we're used to running with them on a regular basis, but those are for what we would call typical standard fire EMS calls, motor vehicle accidents. Something like this on a much larger scale is going to require us to have some better plans in place as to who will respond and how we will respond with what resources and how we're going to go about doing it. One of the things that we've learned through this type of practice and watching other agencies and how they do it, there's a lot of different things that they've pulled from the military, what they call tactical medicine. Alachua County Sheriff's Office does have a SWAT team, but these type of incidents are not going to be initially, they're not going to be a long-term incident. This isn't something where we have time to put a SWAT team together and let them get geared up and plan a form of attack, if you will. This is going to happen so fast that by the time a SWAT team were to get together, this incident's over with. And that's why we need the first line of defense, basically, which is going to be our operations personnel, the ones that are on our ambulances every day, our fire trucks, the ones that are out running the calls, are going to be the first line that gets in and actually handles this type of situation. Again, waiting for the all clear, we're just not doing that. That's not something that is going to be conducive to us saving the many. This is something where it's going to happen very rapidly. We're going to show you here a little bit later how we're going to set up in small teams that we call RTFs, Rescue Task Force. It'll be law enforcement officers combined with EMS personnel. And basically they're just going to go out and start moving through the scene and assessing, evaluating very quickly, treating if necessary, and moving patients to an area where they're going to be much safer so we can get them off the scene. I like this quote. I read this because this basically states every bit of why we're trying to do what we're trying to do. The fate of the injured often lies in the hands of the one who provides the first care to the casualty. Basically put, whether they live or die depends on the first person that gets to them to treat them. How fast we get to them, what we do for them initially, and then everything thereafter. But we are going to be the ones making face-to-face contact with these patients almost immediately after these types of incidents happen. And the decisions that we make and how well we operate is going to determine the outcome with the number of patients and their survivability.
We got one down right here to the left, two down, one to the right.
RTF stands for Rescue Task Force. The point is that we've got a group of firefighters in ballistic gear, ballistic helmets, and specialized medical equipment that are going to go be paired with law enforcement officers from the Spokane Police Department. It'll be able to go into an active threat area like a shooting or an explosive event and get our medical treatment personnel up to the scene much quicker than we have been able to in the past.
Command from RTF-15.
Go ahead.
You breathing? Got 4 wounded. Further down the hallway on the left-hand side. 1 critical, 2 yellow.
Historically, we've always waited back 2 blocks away, waited for law enforcement to come in, clear the entire area of threats and assailants of any kind before fire or EMS even enters the area. And historically, what that's done for us is just our victims inside who have already been injured, they're bleeding out and expiring before we can even get there and provide them any care.
Yes, start a second medic team in here. Any trouble breathing with that?
No.
Good. Make sure we got 3 stretchers.
The idea of the Rescue Task Force has come from a lot of things we've seen in the past. Columbine High School shootings, Aurora Theater shooting, even the Boston bombings. We've seen how people have been injured in areas that are still a threat area, and we're not able to get emergency care to them right away. So law enforcement has changed their tactics to very strongly get inside and stop the threats as they're coming, and we need to keep up with that now and get our medical people inside those threat areas as soon as possible to start treating the people at the point of wounding care, the area, the spot where they're actually shot, and we can do the most amount of care to save their lives down the road.
We got a red here. Okay, everybody ready to go?
Yeah.
Mike? Okay, security, we're ready to roll.
We've trained extensively at this point with patrol, the SWAT team. A lot of law enforcement has seen what we're hopefully capable of doing, and we're getting a lot of buy-in and cooperation through their departments as well.
So gunshot wounds to the chest seals on the front and back. Look for that exit wound, okay? Get them covered up, assess for difficulty breathing. If they're having difficulty breathing, decompress the chest.
1 victim, 2 rooms over. Tell me when it's clear.
A lot of the focuses that we're having in our trainings are two kind of different situations. One is working within a tactical unit in order for us to safely and securely get into a threat area. And then the second part, we are building on our medical knowledge and training to more effectively very dangerous injuries that people are going to have inside the scenes. So we've been training with tactical movements, using ballistic equipment to keep ourselves in protection. Communication is a big issue, communicating with the police back and forth so that we know when it is okay for us to come into a scene and how to get into one of the scenes. And then when we're there, dealing with mass casualty incidents where normally we're used to 3 or 4 firefighters treating one patient, it's totally flip-flopped. Now we've got one person treating 4 or 5 casualties, and that's a big change in our paradigm of how we treat patients. Our kind of key founding idea is that we want to identify our patients and find them, and then treat and stabilize them as quickly as we can and move on to the next person. The key is to get it to as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, in order to save as many people as we can. Not focus on the one or first patient we come to. We want to get through as many people as we can, and once we're out of medical equipment or we're out of patients, we're going to turn around and begin evacuating those patients to definitive care at hospitals.
This will be the last guy. That's it. We're good.
Okay, so hazard zones. We're all familiar with the hazard zones. This goes back to the most basic of things that we were taught: the hot zone, the warm zone, and the cold zone. Obviously, what is hampering our response? Well, most specifically, we're used to the hot zone as far as EMS types of incidents go. That's the area where we're never going to go because there's some type of danger there. The warm zone requires certainly a specific amount of personal protective equipment, and that's usually only for operational personnel doing less than specifically active functions. And then, of course, the cold zone is where we would have everyone that isn't in the personal protective equipment, staging, and those types of things. The problem with that is during an active shooter, number one, we can't determine where these zones are if we have someone on foot that is constantly moving around that is a threat. We may have a general area as to where the shooter is known to be located. We may have a general building or a specific geographic location where they know that perhaps law enforcement has contained them. However, you still cannot put too much specific on a hot, warm, and cold zone. So one of the premises behind this response for EMS is that anywhere that the law enforcement officers believe they have contained or have an active shooter in a specific area certainly will be the general hot zone. Anything else around those immediate areas will be a warm zone, and that is where EMS and law enforcement, specifically in these task force, will be functioning. They'll be going through assessing the number of patients, doing immediate treatments that are required for life-threatening injuries, and then moving them to a better location to where they can have a full triage done, and they can make determinations for them, transporting them to definitive care. The biggest thing is, again, we're going to be utilizing a thing that we call a field treatment site. Some of you from the military may be familiar with what's called a casualty collection point. Just for terminology, we've simply changed ours to FTS. That is also going to be located potentially within the warm zone. And to give you an example of this, if we were to have an active shooter incident per se at a school that has perhaps a gymnasium or a large collection area where we could put a lot of people, we could put all those people inside of that facility, and if the doors are guarded by armed law enforcement officers, even though that is not an absolute safe area, we know that it still qualifies for a warm zone because it is a secure area. And that's something we'll talk about too in terminology that we're going to learn later as we get into these types of incidents. So kind of there's the difference between the two. We have an embedded warm zone within the hot zone, and this is going to be that breaking point for us to determine how far we're going to go, where we're going to go, remembering that constantly, potentially the active shooter could constantly be moving from place to place. So this is going to put us in a position where the hot zone's constantly changing, the warm zone's constantly changing. Our biggest priority that we need to do is we're going to try to get the patients out of harm's way to an area where those who are injured cannot be re-injured should an active shooter suspect come back through the same area again. That's pretty much what's paramount for us. We're going to try to serve the masses as fast as we can. Certainly it's going to be a combined effort. We're going to have to get used to following the direction of law enforcement. This is going to be something different than what we're used to doing. We always kind of, even though we communicate on scenes where we're needed, we don't kind of specifically follow under each other's direction per se. We kind of work in a joint effort, but everybody covers their own little part. You know, we always handle patient care, hazard mitigation, for example, like on a motor vehicle accident. Law enforcement officers handle traffic control and report information, and usually a lot of times we don't really speak that much. In an incident like this specifically, we are going to be working directly hand in hand together to mitigate this incident from beginning to end. So best utilization of resources. Large response by law enforcement. Certainly we have a lot of agencies in this area. Depending on where the incident were to occur, we have GPD, ACSO, UPD, and then of course the surrounding communities have their law enforcement officers as well. So it depends on what agency would be primary as to where we go. Our goal is to do this on a large enough level to where we have worked with enough of these agencies that they understand our plan of action. They understand what it is we as EMS responders want to do and work with them in conjunction to be able to accomplish those tasks. Certainly we're going to use proven principles. We got a lot of our information from Arlington, Virginia. They were one of the initial people in the U.S. to establish this type of setup for active shooter, utilizing their EMS personnel in the rescue task force forms. Economy of force. This is simply getting as many people as we can to the scene, law enforcement overwhelming the scene, trying to either isolate or eliminate the active shooter in conjunction with EMS personnel, treating as many patients as they can as fast as they can. A lot of the things that is going to come out of this is for those law enforcement officers that we're going to be training with. Some of them have military backgrounds. Some of them have even been military medics. Those that have no medical experience, they are going to somewhat learn some basic things, which I know we've already seen out there in the field. Application of tourniquets, simple drag and carries that they can use to get patients out of harm's way. Ultimately, though, remembering that law enforcement's sole objective is to either isolate or completely eliminate the active shooter, and our main or sole objective is to treat patients and get them transported to definitive care. So we talked about this earlier, the casualty collection point. For those of you that were in the military, we're going to use the FTS nomenclature for field treatment site just for the purposes of our SOPs and SOGs. This is going to be an area that's going to be established once the incident commanders get on scene and start to assess the situation and the potential for how many number of patients we have. They're going to choose a predetermined point that once EMS personnel with their body armor along with law enforcement go in these RTF teams and start to bring patients out, they will all go to a sole collection point if possible. Sometimes based on the geography of the particular area, it is necessary to set up more than one collection point just for the ease of not taking patients further than they have to go, or for the ease of resources. But we will try to utilize one field treatment site to collect all of these patients, where a further head-to-toe assessment and the actual nature of the full injuries of each patient can be assessed, a determination of their severity, and ultimately a decision as to where and when they will be transported can be determined. And this is going to take a very large group effort. This is going to go in conjunction with a lot of the training that we've been doing and some more training we have coming up, like our START triage. We've all been through that before. The field treatment site is specifically where that's going to take place. Anything prior to that is going to be very rapid, very minimal. There's not going to be a lot of triage when we make initial patient care, and we're going to get into that here in just a moment. So police response. Rapid response tactics. They're going to set up perimeters initially so they can at least contain who the active shooter is, so that they don't get further from the area and potentially cause more harm. Threat mitigation. They have one responsibility. The active shooter is an active shooter because they have already shown they are willing to cause harm to as many people as possible in as short amount of time as possible. This is not a negotiating type of incident, so law enforcement is basically looking for the person responsible and trying to eliminate that threat. Initially, they will try to set up one of their command officers with one of our district chiefs to begin the unified command. That will begin the process of all the agencies responding, having communications with each other. Law enforcement is going to be the early key in determining what the relatively safe zones are, where we can go, where we cannot go without necessary law enforcement protection, staging areas, and certainly any other areas, because we all know that media has a way of getting a hold of these things when they happen as well. And certainly if we were to have something like this in our area, there's going to be a lot of people coming to this scene very quickly. They're going to establish their foothold with what they believe is the means to either isolate or eliminate the active shooter. For us, again, we're going to establish the FTS, the field treatment site, as early in the incident as possible. And then they're going to start setting up security officers that are assigned to the field treatment site. Any areas that are considered safe areas but not completely secure areas. And then they're going to start breaking up into groups to be assigned to our EMS personnel for the rescue task force, which we, again, will cover here a little bit later, to start going in and treat patients and get them out of the incident. Fire and EMS response. This, for a lot of us, is going to be the biggest change. Initially, once we get to the scene, and we'll read a little bit more about this when we go over the SOP, SOG a little bit later when that is approved through our administration. We are going to have body armor assigned to these personnel. They will show up and put on the appropriate BPE, as we're calling it, ballistic protective equipment. They're going to be assigned in a rescue task force form with 2 law enforcement officers minimum, as well as 2 EMS personnel minimum for a minimum team of 4. And then they're going to begin going into these warm areas of the warm zone and finding patients, doing any immediate treatments that are necessary, having anyone who can self-evacuate that has not done so to do that very thing, get themselves out, and then begin to start taking these patients out of these areas and get them to the field treatment site. The initial triage is going to be very quickly. It was not like a traditional triage that we're used to, where we start identifying severity of wounds and those types of things. The initial triage is nothing more for us than identifying, is there something immediate that I need to stop right now? Is the patient living, or have I declared them dead? And how many do I have to move right now? And that's really all we're looking at. This is not going to be anything that is methodical at this point. That's going to be happening later when we get these patients to the field treatment site. As it says here, treatment, we're going to provide very minimal life-saving interventions initially out in these warm zone areas, because we're all still under the protection of law enforcement and potential threat by an active shooter should they come back to these areas. You're going to be able to review in the EMS protocols the very basics that we're looking for: major bleeding control, certainly anything control that as it pertains to airway, which is simply opening the airway and securing it. We're not going to be doing intubations or king tubes out in these warm zone areas. We're not starting IVs or giving medications out in these areas. Pleural decompression, we're going to cover chest wounds, any major fractures that would require immediate care in order to facilitate moving the patient without causing further life or limb harm. And that's pretty much it. This is going to be very rapid. It's going to happen very quickly, and this is something that everyone is in their own mind for this particular type of incident is just going to have to get embedded and get used to and train over and over again. We're so used to trying to do as much as we can, but in this case, we're going to be doing very, very little initially. We will have a transport officer assigned to the field treatment sites that's going to coordinate with the local hospitals as well as the command. Certainly, if we have a large enough incident, we're going to be having mutual aid units coming from elsewhere, possibly aircraft coming to fly patients to other trauma centers, and that's going to take a dedicated person who can assign these units so we know how many patients there are and make sure they get to the appropriate location for the treatment that they need. The benefits of having a casualty collection point, or as we're going to call it, the field treatment site. Number one, that's going to be our quickest way to determine how many patients we have. when they're scattered over different areas throughout the scene. You may get multiple reports on the same patients, but once we're able to collect them all in the same area, we won't have the same patients that get counted for twice. It also puts us in one general area for treatment, for resources, so they're not spread out thin, so that we know exactly what we need and who we need it from. It does help us have better efficient prioritization in determining what facilities they need to go to. For example, someone needs to go to a level 1 trauma center for surgery versus, we have some of the walking wounded that can wait or can be seen at a lower level type of medical facility. This type of area as well has dedicated law enforcement officer that will remain there as security for that area. They will never leave, which gives us the ability to function without having to worry about an active shooter possibly coming back to that same area. As they list here, a quick connect. It's a place where we can have resources from law enforcement and EMS and fire and any other agencies meet up all at the same time to get together quick and do anything that needs to be done on the scene. And certainly it makes the whole scene easier to manage if we have a lot of our resources in one spot where we can communicate with each other better and have an idea of what's going on rather than everybody being spread out in multiple locations throughout the incident. So the life-saving timeline, obviously we begin with whatever the mechanism of injury is and get all the way to the end of definitive care once patients reach to the hospital. And there's going to be some very quick steps through that process that get us from beginning to end, and it's going to seem like it's probably a lot faster than what we're used to. As I said initially, law enforcement responds. As they're indicating here, an FOB, a forward operating base, that's their foothold. That's what gets them in the door to establish where the active shooter is, identify where they need to put their officers to somewhat at least secure some areas to make them safe enough for us to operate. They're going to identify for us the field treatment site, establish the security for it, so they have the dedicated law enforcement officers. Our RTF teams will immediately begin to deploy and start grabbing wounded individuals and getting them to this field treatment site where we have other EMS personnel that are able to do some of the more definitive care things, getting the IVs, medications as necessary, and assess them further. We will certainly have more incoming units coming into the field treatment site. This definitely is going to be a mass casualty incident. Most of them are. And certainly we have resources necessary that we here in Alachua County, like MSU 17, we could utilize. And we've also got the input of some of our local hospitals where they have offered to send physicians out to the scene to assist us with a large amount of patients. And then certainly medical transport, that's going to be the biggest part of it. And knowing that we have the 12 rescues that we have along with our critical care trucks in our peak load division, certainly a large enough incident will utilize all of those resources in addition to anything coming from mutual aid. And another thing to consider too, which will be for the command staff, is that some of our partners that would be coming into this area for mutual aid, the time frame on what it would take for them to get here, because they're probably already running calls just like we are. So this is going to be a large scale incident that's going to take a lot of planning and a lot of practice, so that should it happen, we can transition through these phases very, very smoothly. So lessons that we're going to learn by training together. Certainly a benchmark timer to kind of get a real life of what should happen and when and how fast should it happen in an incident like this. Willingness to compromise, that's obviously a big one. Everybody likes to take their stance on how they do things. Law enforcement, EMS, fire. We all have ways of how we do it, but when we start to train together, we realize that our way is not always the best way. We can learn ways to be more efficient, learn ways to be more productive, and to be more effective. There is a cross-agency appreciation. We all know that when we train with other agencies, we learn different things. We have an appreciation for what they do, and they certainly have an appreciation for what we do. This will certainly improve our daily operations by all of our personnel having the basic concepts and the training should an incident like this happen, that even units on the road without having command officers and a full incident command established have an idea of what they're getting into, and what they can do even leading up to getting to the scene to be prepared to go into action. They have learned a lot of things where 911 and the communication systems between interagencies were not as good as they should have been, so we can have process improvement on that. And then certainly it'll establish a tradition for us with our agency as well as the others around here, that we all work together close-knit for the same common goal. So where do we begin? This PowerPoint was to kind of give you the idea of what you can expect of what's going to be upcoming for our active shooter throughout our department, the training that we're going to provide, as well as what the rapid treatment model for active shooter is, so you can be aware. Feel free to look it up, do some research on it, study yourself to kind of get an idea of what it's about and who's doing it. This is a paradigm shift in EMS response. You know, again, as I've said before, and I'm going to stress it again, the scene safe BSI in this particular incident no longer exists because the scene will not be safe. And I know that's probably something hard for a lot of people to comprehend. It's just something it's going to take practice with. We are going to be doing district drills to familiarize everybody with the specific functions and actually how you're going to operate. We are working right now with the state to get a possible grant for the ballistic protective equipment. That we should have some information on that shortly, so that we can outfit our personnel with the necessary equipment for these scenes, and you will all certainly be familiarized with it. We are going to start doing more joint training with law enforcement. We do have an upcoming active shooter that the training division will bring to us sometime later this year. And we also have updates to our EMS protocols regarding what, as I spoke about earlier, the TECC, which is where we've adapted some of the military frame of minds, the Tactical Emergency Casualty Care initiatives for the more civilian population and what we do with public safety. And these are things that are all going to be transpiring throughout the next few months out through the end of the year. Certainly, if you have any questions, feel free to ask the training division, and we look forward to coming out and getting these training scenarios started. Thank you.